Tonight you'll raise a glass, clink it against someone else's, and say, "Cheers," for a reason you couldn't really explain. Maybe it's a birthday. Maybe it's just Friday. You'll take the sip and go right back to complaining about the group chat that took 4 days to agree on a restaurant. Strip all that away and set that same impulse down on a hillside in southern Turkey, 11,000 years before anyone plants a single seed of wheat. Hundreds of people were already gathering there, carving stone pillars taller than a person and brewing something that looks a lot like beer. Before farming. Before permanent houses. Before there was even a word for party. The celebration came first. Everything we now call civilization followed behind it, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the party came before the farm, before the house, before the village, what does that say about which one your brain actually needs? Archaeologists found stone basins there big enough to hold over 150 gallons at once, enough to get an entire hillside drunk before anyone even had a house to stumble home to. The site is called Göbekli Tepe, and for decades archaeologists assumed it simply couldn't be real. Monuments were supposed to come after farming, not before it. You needed a food surplus, a settled population, an organized labor force. None of that was supposed to exist yet. German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt spent almost 20 years excavating the site anyway, and what he found didn't fit the old story at all. T-shaped limestone pillars, some over 5 meters tall, some weighing 10 tons, carved with foxes, boars, vultures, and cranes, arranged into ring after ring of stone enclosures, built by people who were still hunting gazelle for dinner, 6,000 years before Stonehenge existed. No metal tools, no wheels, no draft animals, just hundreds of people dragging 10-ton blocks of quarried limestone across open ground with rope and raw coordinated effort, on purpose, to build a hillside with no houses on it at all. And it gets stranger. Behind some of the pillars, fragments of human bone have turned up in the soil, bodies that appear to have been left out deliberately, exposed to open air rather than buried. It's not a detail Schmidt's team expected to find at what was already, by every existing theory, a site that shouldn't have been possible. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. How do you get hundreds of hunter-gatherers, people who don't even live in one place yet, to show up on the same hillside at the same time, carrying nothing but stone tools? There's no calendar, no messenger running between camps, no group chat. The bones answer it, the animal ones at least. Archaeologists have pulled over 100,000 bone fragments out of the site, most of them gazelle, butchered in the same short window over and over for centuries. Alongside them, more than 10,000 grinding stones, used to process grain on a scale far beyond what any single family would need. Somebody was organizing feasts large enough to feed a small army of laborers, which means somebody, 11,000 years ago, had already solved the one problem your group chat still can't manage, actually getting everyone to show up. And there's no trace of anyone actually living there permanently. No household trash, no hearths for daily cooking, nothing that looks like home. People traveled in, worked, feasted, and left. It wasn't a village. It was an event. For most of the last century, historians assumed the order of events ran the other way entirely. Farming came first, the theory went, because you need a stable food source before you can afford to throw a party. Bread, then beer. Stability, then celebration. Then, in a cave called Rakafet, on the slopes of Mount Carmel in Israel, archaeologist Dani Nadel and his team examined stone mortars carved directly into the bedrock, dated to roughly 13,000 years ago, older than Göbekli Tepe, and centuries before anyone in the region had domesticated a single grain. The people who carved them were Natufians, not full nomads anymore, But not farmers yet, either. Caught in that in-between stage where you start returning to the same caves and hillsides year after year without quite settling down. The mortars sat beside a graveyard of about 30 burials, some of them lined with wild flowers pressed into the stone before the body was laid down, others accompanied by animal bones left as offerings from the feast itself. Residue analysis on the mortars showed something unmistakable: malted, mashed, fermented wheat and barley, brewed specifically to be drunk at funerals. It wasn't good beer. Cloudy, sour, barely alcoholic. Nothing you'd order twice. Nobody at that graveside was checking tasting notes. Here's where it gets interesting. Researchers now argue the sequence may have run backward from what everyone assumed for 60 years. The desire to brew, to gather, to mourn together over something fermented that came first. The pressure to actually domesticate wild grain, instead of just harvesting it in the wild, may have followed the party, not the other way around. Beer before bread, not bread before beer. The economy didn't build the celebration. The celebration may have built the economy, which flips the entire progress first, pleasure second story we've been telling about our own species. Sit with the scale of that for a second. By the time Egypt raises its first pyramid, this exact habit, gathering a crowd, fermenting something, getting an entire community mildly, deliberately drunk together, is already 8,000 years old. It predates writing. It predates the wheel. It predates pottery. Based on what's buried in that cave and on that hillside, the party is older than almost every other invention we'd put on a timeline of human progress. 2,000 miles, and about 10,000 years later, the same pattern shows up again, bigger and louder. At Durrington Walls, the settlement built right beside Stonehenge, archaeologists believe as many as 1,000 houses once stood, enough to hold roughly 4,000 people, making it, for a brief window around 2500 BC, the largest known settlement anywhere in northern Europe. And it wasn't built to last. Evidence suggests the village stood for barely a decade before it was abandoned, as if the whole point had been the gathering itself, not the place. Somewhere out there, a Neolithic landlord was having an extremely bad decade. A road nearly 100 feet wide once ran from the settlement down to the river, built wide enough for a crowd, not a family. Archaeologists Mike Parker Pearson and Umberto Albarella studied tens of thousands of pig bones from the site and found something strange. The pigs were slaughtered almost exclusively in midwinter, 9 months after a springtime birth, timed to the same point in the solar calendar that Stonehenge itself was built to track. Isotope analysis on the animal's teeth showed cattle brought in from as far as Wales and Scotland, hundreds of miles, on foot, just to be eaten at one gathering. There's a piece of this story most people have never heard. Out of roughly 38,000 animal bone fragments recovered from the site, whole joints of meat were found still attached to bone, thrown away with food still on them. That's not scarcity. That's the opposite of scarcity. Deliberate, visible waste, on purpose, in front of everyone. Anthropologists call this costly signaling, proving to your neighbors you have so much, you can afford to throw it away. It's the same logic behind a wedding that costs more than a semester of college, or a birthday spent on something nobody strictly needed. The excess was never really about the food or the money. It was the message the excess sent. 3 sites, 3 cultures, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. And the same pattern keeps showing up. Gather the group, feed it more than it needs, and do something together that nobody could manage alone. Which brings us to the part of this story that actually explains why any of it worked. Underneath every one of these sites is the same quiet threat, one your brain has been managing since long before it had language for it: isolation. For most of human history, there was no fallback plan for being alone. No emergency room, no savings account, nobody to call. The group was the entire safety net. Drift too far from it, for too long, and that net simply stops being there when you need it. That threat never announces itself. It just accumulates, one skipped gathering at a time. Your brain has a wiring limit, and you run into it constantly without realizing it. Evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar has spent decades studying the size of human social groups, and one number keeps showing up, roughly 150. That's about how many real relationships one human brain can maintain through one-on-one bonding alone. In other primates, that bonding happens through hours of grooming, picking through fur, one relationship at a time, which is part of why chimpanzee troops stay small, capped by how much one-on-one grooming a day actually allows. Past a certain group size, the math simply stops working. There isn't enough time in a day to bond with everyone individually. Except humans found a shortcut. Dunbar's research shows that singing together, dancing together, drumming and rhythm together, even laughing together, triggers a flood of endorphins, the exact same brain chemistry as one-on-one grooming, except it works on dozens of people simultaneously for the price of one bonfire and one rhythm everyone can follow. Synchrony is cheap. Synchrony scales. A feast, a dance, a drink passed around a circle, that's not decoration bolted onto human society after the fact. That's the technology that let human groups grow past the number any one brain could hold alone. It's the same mechanism running when a stadium full of strangers sings along to the same chorus and somehow feels like one crowd instead of 40,000 individuals. Nobody groomed anybody. Nobody had a one-on-one conversation with the person 6 rows over. The synchrony did the work by itself. Your body is still running that exact same wiring right now, whether you notice it or not. That group chat that took 4 days to agree on a restaurant. That's the same impulse that got hundreds of strangers to walk to a hillside in Turkey with no calendar, no invitation, and no phone to argue on. Nobody had to convince them the gathering mattered. Something older than language already had. You'll still complain about the small talk this weekend. You'll still complain about staying too late. You'll still complain about the seating chart and the playlist somebody's fighting over in the corner and the 4 days it took to pick a restaurant in the first place. None of that has changed in 11,000 years. But every time you raise that glass, you're not just making conversation. You're running code older than farming, older than the house you'll walk home to afterward, older than the wheel that got you there. The party was never the reward for civilization. It was the reason civilization happened at all.